So here's a brief preview of what I'll be presenting today. First, I'll provide some background on the proposed amendment. Next, I'll review the framework, process, and timeline that the Commission will use to make its decision. And finally, I'll present the results of the staff analysis and preliminary recommendation, and then I'll quickly review next steps. So please note this presentation is a little over 40 minutes long. I'll do my best to move through these materials quickly, but I want to make sure that the commissioners and the public have all of the information they need to understand the issues before us. So we'll begin with an overview of the proposed amendment, as well as some background on BCDC's laws and policies and how they'll be applied. So in January 2019, the Commission voted to initiate two separate Bay Plan amendments that both relate to the San Francisco Bay Area Seaport Plan. So Bay Plan Amendment 119 was initiated to undertake a general update of the Seaport Plan, and that work is ongoing. BPA 219, the subject of today's public hearing, was initiated at the request of the Oakland Athletics to amend the Seaport Plan and Bay Plan to remove the Port Priority Use Area designation from Howard Terminal at the Port of Oakland. If approved, this amendment would be the first step for the Commission to consider a future permit application for construction of a ballpark and mixed-use development on the Howard Terminal site. However, and as I'll explain further, the scope of the proposed amendment and of today's public hearing is a determination about whether Howard Terminal is needed for regional port priority use, not to evaluate the merits of the proposed ballpark district project. So I'll go into more detail about that later in this presentation. But first, I'd like to take a step back to provide a quick background about BCDC and the purpose of the Seaport Plan as it relates to the agency's mission and the Commission's considerations about Howard Terminal. So BCDC is a state agency that establishes land use policies for development in the Bay and along its shoreline through the San Francisco Bay Plan. And so the Bay Plan was prepared by BCDC and adopted by the state legislature in 1969. And the Seaport Plan, as you can see on this slide, it's a more specific application of the Bay Plan, and it's used by BCDC to help guide its regulatory decisions. So the Bay Plan includes a section with findings and policies that are specific to ports. And as is stated in these findings, there's not a single port agency or authority responsible for coordinating the planning and development of San Francisco Bay Port terminals, unlike, for example, an agency like the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. So in the absence of a regional seaport plan, uncoordinated development of port facilities could lead to unnecessary bay fill. The Bay Plan therefore establishes the Seaport Plan to minimize those risks and to coordinate the planning and development of Bayport terminals and port priority use areas. So the Seaport Planning Advisory Committee, or SPAC, oversaw the development of the original Seaport Plan and its subsequent updates. The SPAC is an advisory body to the Commission whose purpose is to provide expert advice on seaport-related matters. The SPAC may vote to provide recommendations to the Commission, but the Commission is ultimately responsible for voting on Bay Plan amendments. The SPAC is currently composed of representatives from the 5 Bay Area ports, BCDC, MTC/ABAG, the San Francisco Marine Exchange, Caltrans, and Save the Bay. And as you can see in this map on the right, and sorry, it's kind of small, but the Seaport Plan encompasses the 5 Bay Area seaports. And so those include the Port of Oakland, San Francisco, Redwood City, Richmond, and Benicia. These 5 ports serve as critical gateways between Northern California and the global supply chain. And so the existing Seaport Plan has these 5 overarching goals. And to achieve these goals, the plan employs enforceable policies that BCDC uses in regulatory decisions and that local governments use in their land use and regulatory decisions. And so the goals on this slide highlight BCDC's unique role as a regional agency with a regional perspective and responsibility to ensure that there are sufficient shoreline areas to accommodate future growth in maritime cargo across the Bay Area. So one of the most important components of the Seaport Plan are the port priority use designations. So areas that are determined to be necessary for existing or future port development are designated as port priority use areas and are reserved for port-related uses and other uses that would not impede development of the sites for port purposes. And so that designation includes marine terminals, as well as directly related ancillary activities. And the findings and policies included in the SEAPORT plan are informed by a regional cargo forecast that guides decision-making to help realize the plan's goals for coordinated development and minimizing the need for bay fill. So the cargo forecast is thus a critical component of these port priority use areas and of the SEAPORT plan. So that brings us back to Howard Terminal. Howard Terminal, which you can see on the lower right-hand side of the map on this slide, is an approximately 50-acre site located in Oakland's inner harbor on the Alameda Estuary. The terminal is situated on the southeastern edge of the Port of Oakland. It's located east of Schnitzer Steel and just west of the Oakland Ferry Terminal and Jack London Square. So Howard Terminal is designated as a container terminal in the SEAPORT plan, and it's part of the broader Oakland Port Priority Use Area. And that's illustrated in purple on this slide, and that encompasses most of the Port of Oakland, as well as Schnitzer Steel. The total area proposed to be removed by this amendment is approximately 56 acres, and that includes Howard Terminal, as well as adjacent properties owned by Vista and PG&E. The Waterfront Ballpark District project that's being proposed by the Oakland Athletics would be on lands that are partially subject to BCDC's permit jurisdiction. The project proposes a range of non-port uses at Howard Terminal that would conflict with applicable BCDC policies for the existing port designation, and thus removing the port priority use area designation would be a prerequisite for the Commission to consider a future permit application for construction of that project. However, as I noted, BPA 219, this proposed amendment, is not an evaluation of the Ballpark District project itself. So I'm going to take a moment now to clarify the framework that the Commission will use to make a decision on the proposed amendment. So first, General Policy 4 of the SEAPORT plan informs the grounds or basis upon which the Commission should base its decision regarding BPA 219. And it reads, deletions of the port priority use and marine terminal designations from this plan should not occur unless the person or organization requesting the deletion can demonstrate to the satisfaction of the SEAPORT Planning Advisory Committee that the deletion does not detract from the regional capability to meet the projected growth in cargo. Requests for deletions of port priority or marine terminal designations should include a justification for the proposed deletion and should demonstrate that the cargo forecast can be met with existing terminals. So let's clarify how Policy 4 works in regard to the Commission's decision-making. General Policy 4 requires the applicant to make certain demonstrations and justifications in its request to delete a port priority use area. The SPAC and staff have independently evaluated the information provided by the applicant in making respective recommendations to the Commission, but the Commission is the ultimate decision maker. So General Policy 4 implements the basic policy goal for port priority use areas per the McAteer-Petras Act, which provides that certain water-oriented uses, like ports, be reserved along the shoreline in order to minimize the necessity for future bay fill to create new sites for those uses. General Policy 4 is an integral part of the Commission's decision-making, but the Commission is not limited to considering information only contained within the cargo forecast. Rather, the Commission should consider all evidence before it relevant to a statutory, regulatory, or policy provision that's applicable to the proposed amendment. Sorry, that's a bit wordy. But additionally, the Commission should evaluate the consistency of the proposed amendment with the McAteer-Petras Act. However, BCDC would only perform an analysis of the proposed ballpark project's consistency with relevant San Francisco Bay Plan policies after a permit application is received. So as a result, the staff report that was circulated on May 2nd provides a high-level analysis of the proposed amendment in relation to these policies, including public access, climate change, and environmental justice and social equity. And those are all topics that would be analyzed in much greater depth during a project permitting process if that were to occur. There's also several specific requirements related to the proposed amendment that were included in Assembly Bill number 1191. So AB 1191 was enacted in October 2019 to outline the role of the State Lands Commission and BCDC in relation to the Howard Terminal project. AB 1191 requires BCDC to determine whether Howard Terminal is needed for port priority use, but it doesn't change any BCDC policies or processes. BCDC is required to make this determination within 140 days of certification of the City of Oakland's final environmental impact report for the Waterfront Ballpark District project. So that EIR was certified in February 17th, and that created a July 7th deadline for BCDC. Also importantly, the bill specifies that if the Port and the Oakland Athletics have not entered into a binding agreement by 2025, then the Port Priority Use designation will automatically be reinstated on the Howard Terminal property as if it had not been deleted. And finally, if the proposed amendment is approved, then the Oakland Athletics continue to move forward with the project, then the project will be required to obtain a BCDC major permit. And AB 1191 also specifies a set of conditions under which BCDC could approve such a permit. So sorry, I know that's a lot of information, but in summary, the Commission is going to be asked to determine whether Howard Terminal is needed for regional port priority use as per the General Policy 4 in BCDC's SEAPORT plan, not to evaluate the merits of the proposed Ballpark District project. Critically, I also want to note that BPA 219 requires an affirmative vote of 2/3 of the Commission members, which is 18 commissioners. So before turning to the staff analysis, I want to provide a very brief overview of the process and timeline. So as I mentioned, BPA 219 was initiated in January of 2019, and this also kickstarted the process of developing a new cargo forecast that was published in May of 2020. And I'm going to talk about the cargo forecast in just a few minutes. But beginning in early September of 2021, BCDC staff engaged in ongoing discussions with the A's as applicant, the Port of Oakland, and the City of Oakland to obtain additional justification for the proposed removal of Howard Terminal. Staff met individually with the A's, the Port, and the City numerous times prior to the SPAC's meeting to evaluate BPA 219 this March. Staff raised several questions relating to the potential need of Howard Terminal for port priority use and asked the A's to work with the Port and City to respond. However, staff received only limited information in support of the amendment prior to the SPAC's meeting to evaluate BPA 219 in March. So on March 16th, the SPAC held a public meeting to evaluate BPA 219. In advance of the meeting, staff circulated a report with preliminary analysis and a record of staff communications with the applicant for the SPAC's consideration. The staff report did not include any recommendation regarding the amendment. But during the meeting, staff made a presentation, followed by the Oakland A's and the Port of Oakland. The SPAC received written public comments ahead of the meeting and heard from public speakers. And after deliberation, the SPAC rejected the first motion to approve the amendment by a vote of 3 to 6 to 1. Then the SPAC voted 5 to 4 to 1 in favor of the following motion on this slide, which opposes BPA 219 based on the standards set by SEAPORT Plan Policy 4. So following the March 16th SPAC meeting, the applicant, in coordination with the City and Port, subsequently provided an array of in-depth information in support of the application. This information was sent in multiple emails between late March and early April, and then as a comprehensive packet of materials on April 8th. Staff undertook a review of these new materials with the assistance from the Tioga Group and consulted with the Port of Benicia regarding ro-ro capacity. This information was incorporated into the staff report and preliminary recommendation that was published on May 2nd. I should also note during this time, there was a briefing on the cargo forecast at the Commission's April 21st meeting. And of course, today, June 2nd, we are holding the public hearing. After today's hearing and the close of the public comment period, as Chair Wasserman mentioned, staff will read, evaluate, and respond to all of the comments received and consider any necessary changes to the analysis that was included in the staff's preliminary recommendation. Staff will then draft and release a final recommendation, likely during the week of June 13 to 17, after which there will be a commission consideration and vote on June 30th, also beginning at 9 a.m. in advance of that legislative deadline on July 7th. So I want to pause to note that as a result of the July 7th deadline imposed by AB 1191, that legislation, staff were unable to schedule a second meeting of the SPAC to evaluate all of this new information that was provided by the applicant in April. Therefore, the SPAC has been unable to weigh in on that information, and we hope that individual members of the SPAC are in attendance today, and we look forward to receiving their individual public comments. So finally, we can turn to the staff analysis itself. After providing you with a brief overview of the site, I'll summarize the analysis relating to SEAPORT Plan Policy 4, and then turn to relevant Bay Plan findings and policies. There's a much greater depth of analysis in the staff report than I could possibly get to today. So please do refer to the staff report for more details. As I mentioned earlier, Howard Terminal is about 50 acres. It has an approximately 2,000-foot long berth and 42 feet of depth in the adjacent navigation channel. And the site has 4 cranes. However, the port has stated that the cranes are not usable. Howard Terminal was most recently used as a container terminal between 2005 and 2013 for domestic container service. And then from 2014 to present, Howard Terminal has been used for a mix of ancillary port uses. Those have included longshore worker training, truck parking and staging, container and chassis storage, cargo transloading, lay berthing, and tugboat docking. Howard Terminal is also now being used as a temporary 25-acre off-terminal and paved container yard as part of an effort to improve the flow of agricultural exports. So I also want to note that the Army Corps, in collaboration with the Port of Oakland, is currently studying the feasibility of widening the Inner Harbor turning basin. And that could involve removing up to 10 acres from Howard Terminal to accommodate the increasing sizes of container ships that are calling at the port. So that's a separate project. And if approved, that project would also truncate part of Howard Terminal's berth, and that issue is discussed and considered in the cargo forecast as well as the staff report. So you'll often see in the cargo forecast, Howard Terminal is referenced as being 40 acres, assuming that 10 acres would end up going toward the turning basin project. So historically, Howard Terminal was actually a series of finger berths, and they were filled in over the years to develop a more modern container terminal. And it assumed its existing configuration in about the year 2000. As the current extent of the wharf was not constructed until the late 1970s and through the 90s, much of that wharf is located within what's called the Commission's Bay jurisdiction. And so BCDC's jurisdiction is illustrated in the map on this slide. The Bay jurisdiction is in orange, and the Shoreline Band jurisdiction is in blue. The port priority use area itself extends upland beyond the Commission's McAteer-Petrosac jurisdiction, both for advisory purposes and for purposes of something called a federal consistency review, and that's under the Commission's Certified Coastal Management Program. So in the next few slides, I'm going to summarize the cargo forecast and the staff's analysis of growth and capacity, and then I'll touch on the physical viability of the site and some kind of other related considerations. As I mentioned earlier, the findings and policies included in the SEAPORT plan are underpinned by this long-range cargo forecast. And in 2019, staff began to work with the Tioga Group and Hackett Associates to develop a new cargo forecast in anticipation of the previous forecast's expiration in 2020. That work was done under the guidance of the SPAC over the course of 3 public meetings with individual ports providing direct feedback about their operations and their data to ensure the accuracy of the findings. After the release of the first draft of the forecast in June of 2019, the Oakland Athletics commissioned a separate consultant, Mercator International, to conduct a review of the forecast as it pertained to Howard Terminal. And that used a different methodology and set of assumptions than the Tioga forecast with differing results. And so Mercator's report accepted the cargo forecast's demand projections, like the forecast itself, but argued that future demand could be met at new and existing terminals without the use of Howard Terminal. So consequently, The SPAC directed staff to further review the Tioga forecast as well as Mercator's report. Staff sent both of these reports out for independent peer review, conducted interviews with terminal operators at the Port of Oakland, and conducted additional staff analysis as part of an extensive review process. The SPAC voted 9-0 to 1 to approve the cargo forecast developed by the Tioga Group in May 2020. And the Port of Oakland's representative voted in favor of approval. Cargo forecast provides projections out to 2050 for three major cargo types that are handled in the Bay Area, or the three major types of cargo handled in the Bay Area. So I'm going to talk about each of these in the presentation, but they're container cargo. So for example, if you're on BART and you look out the window and you see all the containers stacking up, that's what we're referring to, container cargo. The second one is roll-on, roll-off cargo, or ro-ro cargo, and that refers to cars being imported and exported. And then the third one is dry bulk cargo, and most of that's like construction-related material in the Bay Area, like gravel, or it could be grain, something like that. And the forecast also includes an inventory of the remaining capacity, like the sites that are left that are within BCDC's jurisdiction. So we'll talk about that too. And I should mention that I believe Dan Smith from the Tioga Group has joined us today and should be available to take any clarifying questions about the forecast. So the cargo forecast was produced using a cargo-specific methodology. And so what that allows you to do is to account for issues that are very specific to the Bay Area and those three types of cargo that I just mentioned, in addition to kind of broader economic and trade factors. So within the forecast, growth refers to projections about the volume of cargo, like how is cargo going to grow? And a moderate or base forecast was first developed, and then various factors were tweaked to illustrate slow or strong growth scenarios too. And then productivity refers to the efficiency that ports can move that cargo. And the forecast also accounts for increases to productivity in the future. And it has three different productivity scenarios. So similarly, a base productivity scenario was developed, and those are also specific to each type of cargo. And then factors were tweaked to create low and high productivity scenarios. So there's a lot going on here, but basically the forecast combines these growth and productivity scenarios, and that kind of accounts for a matrix of future possibilities for cargo capacity in the Bay Area. As you might imagine, it's likely that the three major types of cargo aren't going to experience the exact same demand for growth or the same kinds of improvements to productivity, but all of them are going to be affected by the same underlying regional economic trends. So that's a bit about the forecast methodology. So now we'll get into each of the three types of cargo. And for containerized cargo, the forecast found that under a moderate growth scenario, that baseline growth scenario, the Port of Oakland would be somewhere between 98 to 100% capacity by 2050. And that assumes a 67% basically average productivity increase by that date. So that productivity increase is based on something called industry benchmarking, but it should be noted that this increase is not guaranteed, and it would require significant levels of investment to achieve. And then the table on this slide illustrates some of these different growth scenarios and basically where the port's capacity would be at in these scenarios. You'll see that the reason that there's a table here that includes berth 20 to 21, and that's because there's an active proposal to develop a dry bulk project known as Eagle Rock aggregates at those berths. So if those berths were unavailable for container handling, it would somewhat increase that pressure for container cargo. However, the Port of Oakland has noted that the Eagle Rock project is going to have lease terms that include off-ramps. So if that area is ever needed for container use in the future, they could switch. Either way, the bigger picture here is about the same. By 2050, the Port of Oakland, under a moderate growth scenario, would have little or no room for growth go beyond that date. Of course, there's inherent uncertainty to this process, and growth could occur faster or slower than projected. And similarly, assumptions about future improvements to productivity could fail to materialize. So in their materials submitted in April, the port states that the slow growth scenario, which is about a 1.3% compound annual growth rate, is reasonable for long-term container growth, and that the moderate growth scenario, which is 2.2%, is on the high end of reasonable grade. And more specifically, they note that in undertaking a review of the port's container volumes, the most substantial growth occurred from 1998 to 2005, when the port expanded and added 600 new acres from the decommissioned Fleet Industrial Supply Center at Oakland, or FISCO. In response, in reviewing these materials, the memo prepared by the Tioga Group notes that the 20-year growth rate at Port of Oakland was basically the same as the moderate growth forecast. And the memo notes that the forecast was not based on Oakland's cargo history, but on indications of long-term demand and economic growth. So in other words, cargo growth is generated by demand, not by capacity. Staff looked into previous communications with the port and note that as of April, the port is providing different responses and feedback to BCDC and the Tioga Group as compared to when the forecast was being developed. For example, the port previously recommended a 3% moderate growth rate in 2019. So based on reviewing all of this information, the staff preliminarily conclude that moderate or base rate forecast of 2.2% that was approved by the SPAC remains appropriate and reasonable, and staff recommends its use for evaluating the proposed amendment. Under this scenario, staff preliminarily conclude that the applicant has demonstrated that removing Howard Terminal for the purposes of container handling would not detract from the regional capability to handle cargo growth within the forecasted planning horizon. However, staff note that the port would be at 98 to 100% capacity for containerized cargo without Howard Terminal, with little room for growth beyond 2050. And that does depend on the port achieving that kind of substantial increase in productivity. And so those are some of the key points for the commission to consider. Before moving on to the next type of cargo, I want to highlight another issue that emerged in just the days leading up to the release of the staff report and preliminary recommendation. And it relates to the Port of Oakland's marine terminals and acreages. So this is new information, and it was discussed in the Tioga memo, but not in the May 2nd staff report. And this basically relates to how much container terminal space exists and is needed by 2050. So on the map on this slide, and I hope you can see it okay, you can see the Oakland International Container Terminal, or OICT. OICT is currently using approximately 25 to 30 acres of off-dock land for container staging operated by their sister company called Shippers Transport Express, or STE. And so STE provides a premium service for shippers for faster container retrieval. So containers are driven off of the OICT terminal onto, I believe, public streets, and you can see that in red on this map, up to that STE site. So in the cargo forecast, which you can see in this table on this slide, this off-dock staging site was indicated as basically being not usable as long-term terminal space. And that was at the direction of Port of Oakland staff when the forecast was being developed. Leading up to the release of the staff report, the Tioga Group realized that the site was accidentally included in summary tables in the cargo forecast that show, these summary tables basically show where are the available future expansion sites. So staff wanted to query the Port of Oakland about this, but were unable to do so prior to the release of the staff report, but did so in early May. And the port responded stating that this STE site does in fact serve as an off-dock terminal, augmenting the on-dock capacity of SSA's operations at OICT. So this response is different from the direction that the port previously gave, but the port notes that over the past 2 years, they've invested $19 million into improving this site for STE as an off-dock terminal, and so now it should be included. So staff notes that this site is not a water-dependent marine terminal, and is therefore unlikely to achieve the same level of productivity as terminal sites on the waterfront. We're getting a little bit of feedback there. Oh, thanks. However, this site does reduce overall dwell times at OICT, it improves the overall efficiency of container movement through the port, and so it can't be discounted either. So without the SDE site for future expansion and increased productivity, the port would have a 9-acre deficit in 2050 without Howard Terminal, but with SDE, it would have a 21 or 22-acre surplus. And staff believes that the utility of this site is probably kind of somewhere in the middle. But these marginal differences don't change the overall picture, that by 2050, the port would be close to or at capacity with current available acres. And so ultimately, the staff looked at this issue, but would not recommend any change to the preliminary conclusion regarding container capacity. And sorry, I know that's a bit in the weeds, but I am happy to take questions about that when the time comes. Okay, moving on to ro-ro cargo. As I mentioned, that refers to cars, trucks, and other wheeled cargo that's driven on and off specialized ships. So ro-ro vessels are typically much smaller than container vessels. And the ports of Benicia and Richmond primarily import vehicles, and the Port of San Francisco handles export vehicles. So for ro-ro cargo, under similar growth and productivity assumptions, the forecast concluded that the Bay Area will need about 160 additional acres of ro-ro terminal space. Howard Terminal was identified as one of 3 possible expansion sites that in total would be 127 acres, leading to a possible shortfall by 2050. However, in materials submitted by the applicant this April, the applicant identified additional existing capacity, basically acres that were already in use at the Port of Benicia that would reduce the number of acres needed by 2050. So that's explained in detail in the staff report, but in short, it reduces the kind of future need for this roll-on, roll-off space from 160 acres to something more like 114 additional acres. So that additional capacity is not as much as the amount stated by the applicant in their materials, but it is significant, and staff incorporated this change into its analysis. Regardless of additional existing capacity, Amports, the Port of Benicia, has been operating basically at 100% capacity in Benicia with no room for additional growth there, and it's thus expanding operations further upriver in Antioch. So just a few quick notes about ro-ro cargo. So first, the applicant highlights that Amports is moving to expand operations in Antioch outside of BCDC's jurisdiction. So staff hasn't identified a policy basis to consider areas outside of the port priority use areas and outside of BCDC's jurisdiction. The Commission can't guarantee that those areas would be reserved for port use, and it's unclear how staff would decide what areas outside of BCDC's jurisdiction should or should not be included in its analysis. So staff therefore suggests that the Commission consider how growth can be achieved with and without Howard Terminal within existing port priority use areas. Second, and this came up during the forecast briefing, the applicant notes that ro-ro exports have dropped and that the slow growth scenario may be most appropriate. The Tioga memo in response notes that ro-ro volumes have indeed declined, and there's a well-documented worldwide shortage of new cars due to the COVID-related production losses and supply chain disruptions. The staff acknowledged that there have been shifts in export in Tesla production, but the long-term impact is unclear. Nevertheless, after the forecast briefing in April, staff asked the Tioga Group to analyze what would occur basically if ro-ro exports were to experience that slow growth. And the results basically came back that slow growth would indeed reduce ro-ro needs substantially from about 114 additional acres to about 36 additional acres. So a fairly substantial difference, if that were to occur. And then third, the applicant states that ro-ro facilities could use parking structures, so basically parking garages, to increase ro-ro capacity in existing spaces. But the cargo forecast already uses industry standards to account for future productivity improvements. So parking structures are not industry standard and are generally prohibitively expensive. And staff confirmed that again with the Port of Benicia. And staff therefore believes it would be overly speculative to incorporate consideration of parking structures for BCDC's planning purposes. So in summary, while staff don't agree with all of the points raised by the applicant about growth and capacity for ro-ro cargo, with these revised estimates at Benicia, staff preliminarily finds that the applicant has demonstrated that removing Howard Terminal wouldn't detract from regional capability to meet projected growth in ro-ro cargo. Okay, and then last cargo type, dry bulk cargo. As I mentioned, that refers to commodities that are carried in bulk, like grain or gravel. And dry bulk imports handled through the Bay Area ports have long been dominated by construction industry needs. Dry bulk represents a relatively small portion of cargo handling in the Bay Area. And under the moderate growth scenario, an additional 12 acres would be needed for dry bulk by 2050. That was previously revised down from an anticipated 30 acres due to a correction relating to the volume of scrap metal. So similar to other cargo types, the forecast also accounts for increased productivity based on a range of Bay Area industry benchmarks. And then moving on to applicant materials and analysis again. So first, the applicant provided information to staff, basically stating that the elimination of coal and pet coke exports, and that's due to local city council actions, would reduce overall dry bulk demand. The Tioga memo in response notes that the forecast already anticipated a decline in the export coal tonnage and no growth in pet coke exports, and that both commodities account for a small portion of overall dry bulk throughput. Second, the applicant notes that due to a recent settlement between the city of Oakland and something called the Oakland Bulk and Oversized Terminal, that 33-acre site would be available to accommodate dry bulk in the future. But kind of similar to the issue in Antioch, that area is also outside of the port priority use area, and staff don't have any guarantee it would be retained for waterborne cargo handling. And then third, as the applicant states, the proposed 18-acre Eagle Rock aggregates project would already exceed that regional projected need of 12 acres through 2050, and staff agreed. So under the moderate growth scenario, removing Howard Terminal would not detract from the regional capability to meet the projected growth for dry bulk cargo. So I know this is a lot of information, but I'll summarize the cargo forecast and explain what this means for future capacity in the Bay Area. And again, I know there's a lot going on this table, but this is basically an inventory of the remaining sites across the Bay Area that are within the port priority use areas and are dormant or underutilized. In other words, here are the kind of possible expansion sites that are port priority use area. As you'll see, the vast majority of the remaining sites here are at the Port of Oakland, with some capacity in San Francisco at Pier 96 and Richmond's Terminal 3. If you add all of these sites up, as you can see in this table, you have 321 acres of possible expansion sites, including Howard Terminal, or 283 acres without it. And so this table also illustrates the potential uses for each of these sites, and that's like with those green check marks. So some sites are potentially only appropriate for one or two types of cargo. So for example, if we look at Richmond Terminal 3 on here, you can see that it's indicated as for potential use for ro-ro or dry bulk cargo, but it's not a feasible site to handle container cargo. So that's kind of how that works. And of course, it's important to remember that each of these expansion sites can only accommodate one type of cargo at a time. So the applicant has stated that the Eagle Rock Aggregates project, which is at berths 20 to 21 up there on the slide, are needed to, that the Eagle Rock Aggregates project would allow the Port of Oakland to meet the dry bulk forecasts. But they're also stating that the ER lease could be terminated if those berths 20 to 21 are needed to meet the container forecast. And so that flexibility to relocate operations in the future is of course a benefit, but there's only so much total available space. So either there'd be additional pressure on container operations if that area was used for dry bulk, or the dry bulk would need to be relocated somewhere else if that area was needed for container operations. So we just have to be careful not to double count space. And the bottom table here that's a little bit separated on this slide shows how many acres would be needed under each of the growth scenarios. So you have moderate growth and base productivity, then in a range of 262 to 292 acres would be needed to accommodate that growth against that availability of 283 acres without Howard Terminal. And that range of 262 to 292 is the difference of whether or not we count that STE site. So what you can see from all of this is that it's very close. If moderate growth occurs and base productivity improvements occur, by 2050, there's almost no room left within port priority use areas across the Bay Area. So as evident from all this information, the Bay Area Seaport system is complex. There are a number of factors that could change our calculations at the margins, but staff believes that the forecast, which at this point has undergone a very detailed level of scrutiny, to accurately illustrate the potential trade-offs relating to Howard Terminal. So for container cargo, as I've said, if moderate growth occurs, the port would be at 98 to 100 capacity for containerized cargo without Howard Terminal by 2050. And that assumes a 67% increase in productivity that isn't guaranteed to occur. Retaining Howard Terminal at the Port of Oakland would be something more like 93% capacity. For RoRo cargo, Howard Terminal could also handle RoRo cargo to fill some of that additional Bay Area need. But as described today, there's additional existing capacity at the Port of Benicia that was not fully captured by the cargo forecast. And finally, Howard Terminal could serve as a dry bulk terminal, but there's less demand for dry bulk, and the use of berths 20 to 21 for the Eagle Rock Aggregates project would reduce that regional need. So those are some of the main conclusions in the cargo forecast about growth and capacity. But the report in the cargo forecast also includes a kind of high-level discussion about the feasibility of Howard Terminal, as a site. And that's included in a dedicated appendix to the report. And it finds that Howard Terminal is suitable for cargo handling, albeit with some limitations that are listed on this slide. The applicant, working with the Port of Oakland, has provided information to support the contention that Howard Terminal is unsuitable for cargo operations, especially after the planned expansion of the Inner Harbor Turning Basin. Staff has reviewed this information, and although the expanded turning basin certainly would reduce the size and berth length of Howard Terminal, staff's preliminary analysis indicates that Howard Terminal would still have the basic physical characteristics needed to accommodate all three types of cargo, although with certain limitations. So as a container terminal, Howard Terminal would be small by West Coast container terminal standards. An expansion of the Inner Harbor Turning Basin again would truncate its berth, and the site would thus be limited to kind of smaller niche container vessels. As a RoRo terminal, Howard Terminal has the basic physical requirements needed to handle RoRo cargo, but exports are much more likely to be feasible there than imports, due in part to the challenges of not having rail access at that site. And as a dry bulk terminal, Howard Terminal has the basic physical requirements needed to handle dry bulk, but it might not be needed for that use. Furthermore, the applicant and Port of Oakland state that rehabilitating Howard Terminal would be cost prohibitive. However, any use for cargo handling would require varying ranges of investments and improvements. And even if Howard Terminal were not found to be financially feasible for cargo operations now, this would not preclude future investments to handle cargo. So staff suggests that the commission kind of carefully consider these issues about the physical feasibility of the Howard Terminal site in its decision-making process. And next, I'll turn to ancillary uses. So as I mentioned earlier, from 2014 to present, Howard Terminal has been used for a mix of ancillary uses, and it's now being used as a temporary 25-acre off-terminal container yard. So ancillary uses such as this one are valid uses under the port priority use designation and can be valuable to the shipping industry and the port. Ancillary uses are also assessed in the cargo forecast, which found that there would be enough ancillary use space available under all three growth scenarios. From BCDC staff's perspective, while the full range of ancillary functions at a port can be very large, BCDC's authority in the context of the SEAPORT plan and the Bay plan is focused on retaining appropriate available sites for water-oriented uses without an alternative upland location. So basically marine terminals for offloading cargo. Ancillary uses, while certainly are protected port uses, generally have an alternate upland location. And so preserving those uses is not a primary purpose of the Port Priority Use Area under the McAteer-Petrus Act. So the conclusion there is that the removal of ancillary uses at Howard Terminal would not detract from the regional capability to meet the projected growth in cargo. I'll also mention on this issue, there are environmental justice related considerations regarding ancillary uses and where they'll be moved to. So I'm going to turn to that issue momentarily. Excuse me. Okay, and this is the last section. So finally, I'm going to turn to a discussion of the proposed amendment as it relates to Bay Plan policies. So each of these issues are fundamental to BCDC's remit as an agency. As I mentioned earlier, however, you'll notice that each policy was evaluated in relation to the limited scope of the proposed amendment. In other words, BPA 219 is not an evaluation of the proposed Ballpark District project. It's a question about whether Howard Terminal is needed for port use. So thus, the analysis of those Bay Plan policies is within that scope. So when considering an amendment to the Bay Plan, the Commission must evaluate effects on existing policies. And some of those policies provide that the Commission should consider certain outcomes of its decision. But if a permit application were submitted to BCDC at a later date for a specific development proposal, only then would staff perform that detailed analysis of that project consistency with Bay Plan policies. So apologies for the repetition there, but I'm just stating that again. So first, Bay Plan Policy 1 on environmental justice and social equity states, the Commission's guiding principles on environmental justice and social equity should shape all of its actions and activities. Consistent with these guidelines, staff has provided a summary in the staff report of the public engagement process associated with the Ballpark project and potential impacts in general terms of the removal or retention of the priority use area. So social vulnerability mapping undertaken by staff shows numerous block groups categorized as highest or high social vulnerability within 1 mile of the Oakland Port Priority Use Area. Those block groups are clustered in the West Oakland, Old Oakland, and Chinatown neighborhoods. In West Oakland, the closest neighborhood to the Oakland Port Priority Use Area, a primary environmental health concern is air pollution. Those ships, equipment, and trucks at the port emit diesel particulate matter and toxic air contaminants, or TACs. These types of emissions have been connected to higher rates of asthma, cancer, heart disease, and stroke in various studies, and all of these ailments have been documented in West Oakland at higher rates than Alameda County as a whole. There are several existing efforts to address air quality concerns in West Oakland. The West Oakland community, led by a partnership between the West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project and the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, developed an AB 617 Community Emissions Reduction Program, and that's known as the West Oakland Community Action Plan, and that was completed in 2019 and includes some port-related strategies to reduce emissions. The Port of Oakland also completed a SEAPORT Air Quality 2020 and Beyond plan in 2019, also aimed at improving air quality. So that's some of important contextual information. The staff report also described some of the potential outcomes from either retaining or removing the port use designation from Howard Terminal. So retaining the port use designation would enable the continued use of Howard Terminal for a variety of port purposes. Redeveloping that site for a specific type of cargo handling, as I've talked about in this presentation, would likely require a BCDC permit. And then the environmental justice impacts under the Bay Plan policies on environmental justice and equity would then be evaluated as part of that process. Removing the port priority use designation from Howard Terminal would make it unlikely for Howard Terminal to be redeveloped for cargo handling, and it may result in the relocation of those existing ancillary uses. The impact of relocating ancillary uses, like truck parking or container staging and labor thing, depends on where these uses are relocated. That issue is discussed in the city's EIR, and that concluded that localized truck-related activities would not move closer to nearby residents due to zoning restrictions and the city's adopted truck management plan. In March, and I believe my colleagues at the city can speak to this more, the city of Oakland also adopted an ordinance to prohibit truck parking throughout nearly all of West Oakland. Finally, there's also some discussion in the staff report about applicant outreach, including a brief summary of the community benefits agreement process that's being undertaken by the A's in the city and the port, as well as outreach with SEAPORT stakeholders to receive input regarding SEAPORT compatibility measures. However, staff want to emphasize that outreach was undertaken in the context of the proposed ballpark project at Howard Terminal. So to staff's knowledge, the outreach didn't focus on this question about whether Howard Terminal is needed for regional port use. Public access policies are, of course, a core element of the Bay Plan and fundamentally an environmental justice issue as well. Existing public access west of Jack London Square is necessarily limited because of use conflicts with the port's safety and security restrictions. The primary shoreline access amenities in this area are Middle Harbor Shoreline Park and segments of the Bay Trail. The Seaport Plan also touches on public access. Policy 2 of the Seaport Plan states that within port priority use areas, non-port uses such as public access and commercial recreation development may be allowed, provided that the use would not impair existing or future use of the area for port purposes. So this policy is really emphasizing that the whole intent of the port priority use designation is to prioritize maritime port uses. Public access is generally incompatible with active marine terminals and other directly related port uses. So again, a determination of consistency with public access policies of the Bay Plan would be evaluated at a later date pursuant to any future permit application. And then finally, the staff report also provides a brief overview of sea level rise impacts to Howard Terminal. The Port of Oakland prepared an AB 691 required port-wide sea level rise impact assessment in 2019. That assessment highlights key vulnerabilities in port assets, noting sea levels where flooding may be experienced and the potential consequences of that exposure. The assessment found that Howard Terminal's shoreline would be overtopped by extreme storm flooding, exposing most of the terminal area, including utilities and access roads. And while Howard Terminal is expected to eventually experience flooding in its current state, future development, whether it be for port or non-port uses on that site, could alter its vulnerability and the vulnerability of surrounding sites. And then finally, I wanted to briefly mention the environmental assessment, or EA. An EA was prepared on behalf of the Commission as part of the preliminary staff planning report, as required per BCDC's regulations for Bay Plan amendments. Per that requirement, the EA has to determine whether the Bay Plan amendment would have any possible significant adverse effects on the environment, and if so, any feasible mitigation measures that would lessen those impacts. The EA concluded that BPA 219, as a change to a planning level designation that would not result in any on-the-ground changes, would not result in any direct significant adverse environmental impact. The EA discusses the potential environmental impacts of the Ballpark project as an indirect effect of the BPA 219, but at a high level for informational purposes. So Commission action on this proposed amendment doesn't commit the agency to approval of the proposed Ballpark project. Rather, the proposed Ballpark project would be subject to its own discretionary approval process by the Commission if a permit were to be submitted by an applicant, and then any few potential impacts of that proposed project would be evaluated at that time. So that includes my summary of the analysis that went into the staff report and preliminary recommendation. On reviewing the cargo forecast, the materials provided by the applicant, the Port of Oakland and the city, the recommendation of the SPAC, and other relevant information, staff preliminarily recommends that the Commission approve the request from the Oakland Athletics to remove the Port Priority Use Area designation from Howard Terminal. And to summarize the results of this analysis, if moderate growth and base productivity occurs, then for container cargo, the port can accommodate growth without Howard Terminal until about the year 2050, but then would be close to or at capacity. And again, that assumes being able to realize 67% increase to productivity over that time period. For ro-ro cargo and for dry bulk cargo, accounting for the additional capacity identified at the Port of Benicia, there would be enough overall capacity until the same time period. But as I'm saying, under these scenarios, we'll have essentially exhausted the available capacity at existing port priority use areas within BCDC's jurisdiction by 2050. So thus, as we mentioned in the executive summary to the staff report, the Commission should carefully evaluate these growth scenarios and productivity assumptions for each cargo type. And second, while there's some uncertainty about the current financial feasibility of using Howard Terminal, staff believes that Howard Terminal does have the basic physical characteristics that make cargo use feasible. So the Commission should also evaluate the physical feasibility of the site. And you've also heard about a number of other related considerations. And I wanted to mention ancillary uses in particular. While ancillary uses would be relocated from Howard Terminal, staff believes those uses would be accommodated elsewhere at the port or offsite. So staff recognizes that the complexity of this issue is broad and deep, and that these constraints limit time for the Commission, staff, and stakeholders to actively and publicly discuss all of these issues at hand. Staff emphasizes that this is a preliminary recommendation, that we're reading every comment we receive, and that the final recommendation on this amendment will reflect on and respond to the input of commissioners, SPAC members, and the public alike. And I know you saw this timeline earlier, but just to remind you, here are the next steps. After today's meeting and the close of the public comment period, staff will read, evaluate, and respond to all of the comments received and consider any necessary changes to the analysis included in the preliminary recommendation. Staff will then draft and release a final recommendation in mid to late June, hopefully the week of the 13th to 17th. And then a Commission consideration and a vote will occur on June 30th at 9 a.m. Prior to that legislatively imposed deadline on July 7th. So the next public meeting will be on June 30th, although it will not be a public hearing. And we finally reached the end. Thank you for your patience. I know that was quite long.